Hello, aloha, y'all. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in, whether live or by rebroadcast. This is a little bit different than most of the other things I do through the camera, online, live, or recorded. This is me reading to you from my book, The Art of Spiritual Leadership 40 Laws to Transform Your Life and the World. And you might wonder, why am I doing this? I wonder sometimes. The reason, and I say that because the book is available for purchase in Kindle, hardcover, softcover, all the major booksellers have it. You can also get the Audible version where I am reading it out loud. And what's different here is, well, we get to hang out and it costs nothing this way. And I will also respond to any comments or questions. So feel free to chime in. I may not notice immediately, though I will sooner or later. And also, I'll share a little bit of the other things related to it, the backstory or stories behind the stories or the whys, those kind of things. Because obviously, when I'm reading it for Audible, don't have that opportunity. So we are up to just about finished chapter 2, The Crack. And actually, I'll skip over the chapter Gifts. That's also available as an optional PDF. You can get that. And we'll jump right into chapter 3, which is called Rock Bottom. Buddhist proverb. From the darkest mud grows the most beautiful lotus flower. What's wrong with him? Jen's words to the nurse kneeling at my side made me feel even worse. I was lying on the floor in the common room, the hard tile cold against my cheekbone as snot dripped from my nose. It was 1995. And the spiritual awakening that had blown me open and brought a bliss I had never known had also caused a crushing and crippling confusion. An unlikely sequence of events had landed me in the psych ward of a small hospital in rural Massachusetts, and I was years from learning that confusion is our friend. He's getting treatment, just like everyone else. The nurse's response was curt, her annoyance clear. Jen, a long-term patient whom I'd met the day I arrived, stood over the nurse and me, casting a protective circle around me, like tape around a body at a crime scene. I'd had no interest in spirituality up to that point in my life, and still had only a vague conception of it that was muddled up with religion. While both my parents had abandoned Catholicism and had never imposed any doctrine on me, faint flavors of obligation, guilt, and sin still trickled out of them. Religion contained essential and defining beliefs about the world. It seemed ludicrous to me that the vast majority of people simply inherited their faith from their parents, who had also most likely never considered it critically for themselves. Nonetheless, God, a term that I could not have used then, reached down, grabbed me by the hair, lifted my head, and said, "Look, there's more to the world than you've been seeing." The highs of that awakening process brought insights, experiences, and wisdom that catapulted me from agnosticism straight past belief into a new realm of spiritual certainty. Within that space, there existed a peace that had not only always eluded me, I hadn't conceived it as possible. Even when the hospital security guard and the police officer had forced me into a straitjacket and paraded me through the ward, reminding me of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I trusted that a benign force was guiding me through it all. There were other moments, though, when I reeled from the loss of my previous understandings. My lack of comprehension of how I'd gotten to the state of oneness with a higher power made me feel unmoored and forlorn. In those first moments on the ward, I'd wilted under the gaze of the patients. That's when I'd first seen Jen. I knew that we'd never met, yet as our eyes locked, neither of us was able to look away. She'd so eerily and entirely reminded me of my sister Casey that it felt as if she was Casey. Rationally, I knew that Jen and Casey had no connection, nothing to do with one another, yet the feeling in my bones suggested otherwise. Jen and I were drawn to each other in ways I didn't understand at first. Yet, as I got to know her story and its similarities to the tragedy of Casey, addictions, suicide attempts, self-abuse, the synchronicities added up to a conviction that we were destined to intertwine. I knew I was to help her in ways I hadn't been able to with Casey. Yet at that moment, face on the cold tile, it was I who needed help. My mind chastised me for having been a self-deluded fool to believe that spirit had been guiding me. The psychiatrist had been right. I did belong locked up. The nurse spoke again. Do you feel like a lost soul? She said it gently, with one hand on my forehead. Uh-huh, nodding my assent into the floor. I didn't know then that her question was a routine one, a standard line. I probably would have agreed with anything she'd said at that moment. I did feel like a lost soul. Despite having experienced rapture, it was only a glimpse, a sneak preview. I had not yet started down any spiritual path. I didn't even know there was a spiritual path, let alone that we are already home. I just felt lost. Master Nan, a leading Buddhist figure of our time, asserted that if the 19th century's disease was pneumonia and the 20th century's cancer, our own era's most significant medical problem is insanity, what he called a spiritual illness. We in the West have evolved in medicine and mental health in miraculous ways. However, there is still a yawning chasm between the spiritual and the medical in the realm of mental health. Only an integrated approach can help us create effective therapies, as madness overlaps with the realms of creativity, genius, and mastery. Paraphrasing one of the greatest minds of the last century, Indian philosopher, speaker, and writer Jiddu Krishnamurti, being well adjusted to an insane society is not a sign of sanity. When faced with mental health crises that contain spiritual elements, the strategy is usually to attempt to blunt the symptoms into submission. Intense feelings, visions, or awareness beyond the world of the senses are all experiences that tend to be dismissed and even ridiculed by psychiatrists who try to suppress them using drugs. Jen still stood over me. I was sure I'd disappointed and perplexed her. You don't belong here, she'd said to me. Sri Bhagwan Rajneesh, subsequently known as Osho, said in his commentary on the Yoga Sutra, the Bible of yoga, that the yogic path cannot begin until one hits rock bottom. Spiritual Leadership Axiom 10. If we don't get lost, we can't get found. And let's check. Susan, hello. Thank you for chiming in. And yeah, thank you. Mental health challenges affect a lot of people, and there's often a lot of desire to hide that, to not talk about it, which oftentimes makes it harder. That's part of why I wrote this part. Thank you. All right, let's go on. Turning poison into medicine. For more than 10 years, Ike Turner had been beating his wife, Tina. Before they'd married, he'd trademarked the name Tina Turner, at once stripping away her former identity and her ability to earn income from her vast talent as a singer. Like many women whose husbands beat them, Tina had learned to read his moods and to do her best to temper her words and behaviors to appease him and avoid his violence. If it had worked at times, her black eyes, cut lips, and broken bones were widely known to be Ike's markings, another sign of his ownership of her. She learned to endure and ignore his many mistresses and affairs, often happening in their own home. Tina's singing and dancing talent was Ike's ticket to success. And with his ambition and orchestration, their popularity grew through the 1960s. On the surface, they appeared to enjoy fortune and acclaim, touring with the Rolling Stones, Tina landing parts in movies, and reaping the financial boons of hit songs. Meanwhile, two critical occurrences came about outside of the public view that eventually changed Tina's story from tragedy to triumph. By the end of the 60s, even with the recognition and reward that came with her singing talent, the humiliation and anguish grew to the point that Tina, not seeing any way out of the suffering, tried to kill herself by swallowing 50 sleeping pills. Quote, "My suicide attempt wasn't a classic cry for help. When I took those pills, I chose death, and I chose it honestly. I was unhappy to be alive. When I woke up, but I never tried it again because I made an important realization, one that changed the course of my life. I came out of the darkness believing that I was meant to survive, that I was here for a reason." If suicide was not to be her way out, it would take many years and much pain before Tina found an exit. Ike threw hot coffee in her face, giving her third-degree burns. He broke her jaw. I couldn't remember what it was like not to have a black eye. When I told my daughter Tina's story, she asked me, "Why didn't she fight back or leave?" That's a tough question, one that Tina also struggled to answer. Even those who have suffered abuse find it difficult to comprehend rationally. The more relevant question for our purpose is how, after all those years of humiliation, did she eventually break free? Back then, in the 1970s, yoga and Eastern spiritual traditions were still barely known in the West, but a friend of Tina's had introduced her to Buddhism, and specifically to the practice of chanting. Tina began chanting daily, sometimes for hours, and in secret, knowing that Ike wouldn't like it. While at first she didn't consciously understand the words, she simply knew it helped her to become both more peaceful and more vital. The chant, Namyo Renge Kyo, through repetition, brings practitioners to self-empowerment. It opens the door to knowledge and the experience of being responsible for one's fate. It helps to move beyond suffering and hardship, to connect to peace. The word Renge in Japanese, Padma in Sanskrit, means lotus. The mantra connects the chanter to the principle that runs through all Buddhism, through all spiritual traditions, that from the deepest, darkest mud, the most beautiful lotus flower grows. After my suicide attempt, said Tina, there were two Tinas. There was Ike's Tina, who said and did all the right things. I worked hard on stage. I jumped out of bed in the middle of the night when Ike insisted that I race to that hellhole of a studio to record a track that had to be done that minute, or else. I fed him soup, massaged his feet, listened to his irrational rants, and took his blows. The other Tina, though, was getting healthier and calmer. While she did what was needed to get by, another part of her, the human spirit part, day by day became a more dominant aspect of her identity. Remember, we are all composed of the human spirit and the human animal. We don't need to do anything to cultivate the animal part, which is hardwired and driven by fear. Its survival instinct already active. On the other hand, the spirit part can lay dormant, its activation requiring cultivation and energy, precisely what Tina was quietly attending to through chanting. So, what was different on that day in 1976 when Ike and Tina landed in Dallas for a show? Ike was hungover from a 5-day cocaine binge and in a horrible mood, though that was common. During the car ride to the hotel, Ike's disposition worsened, and his temper turned to ire and profanity, also par for the course of their relationship. This time, though, Tina swore back at him. That had never happened before. Tina's retaliation surprised Ike. Yet even more shocking was that she hit him right back when he started punching her. To Ike, her strength and unwillingness to take his abuse came out of the blue. Yet, like a snowball quietly gains mass and power as it rolls, so too had her spiritual attention gathered momentum. By the time they reached the hotel, her once stylish white suit was splattered with blood, and her face was swollen and cut. When they emerged from the car, people stared, and while Ike claimed they'd been in an accident, no doubt the onlookers knew better. I looked like a woman who had she said. I looked like a woman who had been broken and silenced. And that's what I wanted Ike to believe, that he'd won the round like he had won all those other fights. In their hotel room, Tina attended to Ike like she always had, as if everything were going back to normal. She encouraged him to nap before they had to leave for their show that night. As soon as he was asleep, she ran. In the 1993 film, What's Love Got to Do with It? It highlights this scene powerfully, both as the victory of a tortured woman finally putting her foot down not to take the abuse any longer, and as a triumph of the human spirit. Tina had cultivated that part of her for long enough that the snowball had become an avalanche. Again, there's no way for those of us who've never experienced the systematic and ongoing torment that Tina had to comprehend how monumental a victory her adrenaline-fueled flight was. And that was just the beginning. The war for reclaiming Tina was far from over. Yet once any of us truly hits rock bottom, the new trajectory can only go one way. All right. I believe that is the pausing point for today. And Cindy chimed in. Hello from Delaware. Hello, Cindy from Delaware. Hello from Maui. Thank you for chiming in. And y'all, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being here. And again, whether it's live or by rebroadcast that you're seeing, thank you, thank you, thank you. Please, any comments or questions? Awesome. I look forward to hearing from you and getting connected. Thanks, y'all. Aloha. Oops. There we go.